For centuries, Rome was the most influential power in the ancient world. Its armies, its politics, and its culture shaped entire regions. But Rome didn't start as a powerful empire. It began as a small community on the Italian peninsula. Slowly, through constant warfare, strategic alliances, and unmatched organization, Rome expanded far beyond anything its early founders could have imagined. So how did this one city rise across the Mediterranean? How did its generals, its government, and its discipline turn it into a superpower? And how did that same empire eventually break apart under its own weight? This is the real story of Rome, its rise, its dominance, and its collapse. Every great story needs a legendary beginning, and Rome's is one of the most famous. It all starts with twin brothers, Romulus and Remus, said to be descended from a Trojan hero and fathered by the god Mars himself. Cast out as babies, they were saved and nursed by a she-wolf before a shepherd found them. As young men, they set out to found a new city, but a furious argument over who should rule it ended in bloodshed. Romulus killed his brother, and on that spot, on April 21st, 753 BCE, he founded a city in his own name, Rome. Of course, this myth was a powerful story for the Romans, giving them a sense of divine destiny. The historical reality is a little more down to earth. Archaeologists tell us the area was settled long before 753 BCE, probably as a cluster of small villages on Rome's famous Seven Hills. Its spot on the Tiber River was a natural crossroads for trade, and over time, these villages grew and merged into a single city-state. For its first 2.5 centuries, Rome was ruled by a series of 7 kings, starting with Romulus. These early rulers, some of whom were from the more advanced Etruscan civilization next door, laid the groundwork for Rome's military and society. But monarchy wasn't built to last. The final king, Tarquin the Proud, was a tyrant whose family's abuses of power became too much for the Roman people to bear. In 509 BCE, an uprising led by a man named Lucius Junius Brutus drove the king and his family out of Rome for good. The Romans swore they would never be ruled by a king again. So they created something revolutionary, a republic, the res publica, or the public thing. Power wasn't in the hands of one man anymore. Instead, it was shared between 2 consuls, elected for a 1-year term, who governed with advice from the Senate, an assembly of the city's most powerful aristocrats. This system of checks and balances was meant to stop any one person from getting too powerful. The Roman Republic was born, setting Rome on an unbelievable path of conquest. The early republic was shaped by constant war. For 2 centuries, Rome fought its neighbors, the Latins, the Etruscans, and other Italian tribes, slowly and brutally bringing the entire Italian peninsula under its control by the mid-3rd century BCE. But that was just the beginning. As Rome's influence grew, it ran headfirst into the other great power of the Western Mediterranean, the naval empire of Carthage. Located in modern-day Tunisia, Carthage was a trading powerhouse with a mighty navy that ruled the seas. A clash between the land power of Rome and the sea power of Carthage was inevitable. It finally exploded into 3 massive conflicts we now call the Punic Wars. The First Punic War was mostly a 20-year naval struggle for the island of Sicily. Rome had a great army, but almost no navy, putting them at a huge disadvantage. But in a stunning show of grit, the Romans built a massive fleet from scratch by reverse engineering a captured Carthaginian warship. They even invented a new weapon, the corvus, a giant boarding plank with a spike that could be slammed down onto an enemy ship, letting their superior soldiers storm across and turn a sea battle into a land battle. After 2 decades of brutal fighting, Rome won, gaining Sicily as its first overseas province. The peace didn't last. The Second Punic War is one of history's most famous conflicts, mostly because of one man, Hannibal Barca. Having sworn an oath as a boy to be Rome's eternal enemy, Hannibal pulled off one of the most daring military feats in history. He marched an army, complete with dozens of war elephants, from Spain, over the freezing Alps, and straight into Italy. For more than a decade, Hannibal tore through the Italian countryside, handing the Romans one crushing defeat after another. His masterpiece was the Battle of Cannae in 216 BCE, where his brilliant tactics led to the near-total destruction of a much larger Roman army. Rome was on its knees, but it refused to break. Hannibal was a genius, but Carthage didn't send him the men and supplies he needed to land the final blow. Rome's massive reserves of manpower allowed it to regroup. A Roman general named Scipio, later known as Africanus, took the war to Carthage's home turf in North Africa, forcing Hannibal to return and defend his city. At the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE, Scipio finally defeated him, ending the war and breaking Carthage's power for good. Half a century later, still paranoid about their old rival, the Romans started the Third Punic War. This wasn't really a war, it was an execution. After a 3-year siege, the city of Carthage was largely destroyed in 146 BCE, its people killed or sold into slavery. With its greatest rival gone, Rome was the master of the Mediterranean. Its legions then swept east, conquering Greece and large parts of the Middle East. The Republic was now an empire in all but name, but this relentless growth had a cost. The flood of new wealth created massive inequality, and the Republic's political system, designed for a small city, started to crack under the strain of running a global empire. Power began to shift from the Senate to ambitious generals, and the Republic began its long, violent slide into civil war. The man who would finally shatter the Republic was Gaius Julius Caesar. He was a brilliant general, a gifted politician, and a man with ambition to burn. In 60 BCE, he formed an alliance with 2 other powerful men, the incredibly wealthy Crassus and the famous general Pompey. This first triumvirate allowed the 3 of them to run Roman politics. Caesar used his power to get himself appointed governor of Gaul, what we now call France and Belgium. For the next 8 years, he waged a brutal and brilliant campaign, conquering all of Gaul for Rome. The war brought him fame, fortune, and the fanatical loyalty of a veteran army. His popularity back home soared, but in Rome, the Senate and his old ally Pompey started to fear his power. In 49 BCE, the Senate gave Caesar an ultimatum: disband your army and come home as a private citizen. Caesar knew this was a trap. It would mean political suicide. He stood with his army at the edge of a small river called the Rubicon, the legal border of his province. He had a choice: obey his enemies or start a civil war. With the words, "Alia iacta est," the die is cast, he led his army across the river and marched on Rome. The civil war was swift. Caesar chased Pompey across the Mediterranean and defeated him. By 45 BCE, Caesar was the undisputed master of the Roman world. Back in Rome, a terrified Senate showered him with honors, eventually naming him Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life. He started a series of reforms, but his absolute power was too much for many senators. They saw him as a king who had destroyed the Republic. On the Ides of March, March 15th, 44 BCE, a group of senators, led by Brutus and Cassius, cornered Caesar at a Senate meeting and stabbed him to death. They called themselves the Liberators, believing they had saved the Republic. they were wrong. Caesar's death didn't fix anything. It triggered another 13 years of civil war. The power vacuum was filled by two men, Caesar's loyal general, Mark Antony, and his surprise heir, his 18-year-old great-nephew, Octavian, whom Caesar had adopted in his will. At first, Octavian and Antony teamed up to hunt down Caesar's assassins. But once their common enemies were gone, their alliance cracked. The Roman world was split between them. Octavian in the west, Antony in the east. Antony's famous love affair with Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt, gave Octavian the perfect political weapon. He painted Antony as a traitor who had gone soft, bewitched by a foreign queen. The final showdown came in 31 BCE at the naval battle of Actium. Octavian's fleet crushed the forces of Antony and Cleopatra. The lovers fled back to Egypt and took their own lives. At just 32 years old, Octavian was the sole ruler of the Roman world. The Republic was dead. A new age was dawning. Having won the war, Octavian now faced an even harder challenge: winning the peace. He knew Romans hated the idea of a king. What happened to his adoptive father was proof enough. So, he put on a masterclass in political theater. In 27 BCE, he went before the Senate and announced he was restoring the Republic and giving all his powers back to them. Of course, it was all an act. A grateful Senate persuaded him to accept a collection of powers and a new name, Augustus, meaning the revered one. He refused titles like king or dictator, preferring to call himself princeps or first citizen. But don't be mistaken, while the Republic appeared to live on, all real power was in his hands. Augustus, as he was now known, had become the first Roman emperor. His 40-year reign kicked off 2 centuries of peace and stability, known as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. After decades of civil war, the empire was finally secure. Augustus created a professional army, established the Praetorian Guard to protect the emperor, and launched a massive building program, famously boasting he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. The emperors who followed continued to expand and strengthen the empire. Claudius began the conquest of Britain. Vespasian and his sons built the Colosseum. The empire's borders stretched from Hadrian's Wall in Britain all the way to Mesopotamia in modern Iraq. This era hit its peak during the reign of the 5 good emperors from 96 to 180 CE, who were chosen for their ability, not by birth. One of them, Trajan, was a brilliant general who expanded the empire to its absolute largest size. His successor, Hadrian, decided the empire was getting too big to defend, so he focused on securing its borders, famously building the wall across northern Britain to mark the edge of the Roman world. This was Rome at its height. A sophisticated network of roads connected the vast territory, allowing trade, messages, and legions to move with incredible speed. Aqueducts carried fresh water into bustling cities filled with public baths, theaters, and libraries. A single currency and one set of laws unified tens of millions of people. It must have seemed like the peace and prosperity of Rome would truly last forever. It wouldn't. Even at its peak, the seeds of trouble were being planted. The reign of Marcus Aurelius, the last of the good emperors, was spent fighting off Germanic tribes and a devastating plague. His death in 180 CE was a turning point. He was succeeded by his son, Commodus, a vain and cruel tyrant whose disastrous reign ended with his assassination. The stability of the last century was gone. What followed was the crisis of the 3rd century, a 50-year period where the Roman Empire nearly imploded. The empire was battered by civil war, foreign invasions, disease, and economic collapse, all at once. Armies were constantly proclaiming their own generals as emperor, leading to a dizzying cycle of coups and assassinations. In that half-century, there were at least 26 different claimants to the throne, and almost all of them died violently. With legions busy fighting each other, the frontiers were left wide open. Germanic tribes like the Goths and Franks poured across the Rhine and Danube rivers. In the east, a newly aggressive Persian empire launched major invasions, even capturing a Roman emperor in battle, a humiliation that was unthinkable just a generation earlier. The constant war crippled the economy, and emperors devalued the currency to pay their soldiers, causing runaway inflation. The empire even began to fracture, with large chunks in the west and east breaking away to form their own independent states. Rome was pulled back from the brink by a series of tough, no-nonsense emperors, most of them soldiers from the Balkan provinces. But it was an emperor named Diocletian who came to power in 284 CE and fundamentally changed the empire to save it. Diocletian knew the empire was too big and too complex for one man to rule, so he did something radical. He divided the empire into two halves, an Eastern and a Western Roman Empire. He would rule the wealthier East, and a co-emperor would rule the West. He later expanded this into a tetrarchy, or rule of four, with a senior and junior emperor in each half. It was meant to create a more stable government and a clear line of succession. While the tetrarchy itself didn't last, this division of the empire into East and West would have huge consequences. Diocletian had saved a sinking ship, but now there were two of them. Diocletian's reforms brought a temporary calm, but the empire he saved was different, more autocratic and increasingly divided. After he retired, his system fell apart, and another round of civil wars began. A new strongman emerged, Constantine the Great. Constantine is one of the most important figures in Roman history. He not only reunited the empire under his sole rule, but also made two decisions that would change the world. First, he became the first Roman emperor to convert to Christianity. According to legend, before a critical battle, he saw a Christian symbol in the sky with the words, "In this sign, you shall conquer." He won, and from then on, he championed the Christian faith. The Edict of Milan officially ended the persecution of Christians, and the religion went from a hunted sect to the favored faith of the emperor. Constantine's second major decision came in 330 CE. He moved the capital of the entire empire from Rome to the old Greek city of Byzantium, which he rebuilt and renamed Constantinople, the city of Constantine. It was a strategic masterstroke, easier to defend and closer to the wealthy eastern provinces and the dangerous frontiers. But this move shifted the empire's center of gravity eastward, leaving Old Rome and the Western Empire to slowly fade in importance. After Constantine's death, the empire was divided again, and the split between East and West became permanent. While the Eastern Empire, centered on the magnificent capital of Constantinople, remained rich and stable, the Western Empire began a long and painful decline. Historians still debate why the West fell, but it was a mix of internal rot and external pressures. The Western economy was failing, crippled by heavy taxes and an over-reliance on slave labor. A string of weak and incompetent emperors were often just puppets of powerful barbarian generals. The Roman army itself had changed, now filled with barbarian mercenaries who had little real loyalty to Rome. But the final nail in the coffin was the relentless pressure of barbarian migrations. In the late 4th century, the Huns, a fierce nomadic people from Asia, swept into Europe, pushing waves of Germanic tribes, Goths, Vandals, and others across the Roman frontiers. In 378 CE, a Roman army was wiped out by the Goths at the Battle of Adrianople, a stunning defeat that shattered the myth of Roman invincibility. The 5th century was one disaster after another for the West. Britain was abandoned. Gaul, Spain, and North Africa were overrun. Then, the ultimate psychological blow. In 410 CE, for the first time in 800 years, the city of Rome itself was captured and sacked by the Visigoths. The Vandals sacked it again in 455. The Eternal City was no longer safe. The Western Roman Empire was now just a hollow shell. The final act came in 476 CE. A Germanic chieftain named Augustus deposed the last Western Roman emperor. In a final, sad twist of irony, the last emperor was a young boy who carried the names of Rome's mythical founder and its first emperor, Romulus Augustulus. Augustus didn't even bother to name a replacement. He just sent the imperial regalia to the emperor in Constantinople, signaling that the Western Roman Empire was finished. The fall of Rome in 476 CE is often seen as the moment Western Europe fell into what used to be called the Dark Ages, what historians now more often describe as the early Middle Ages. But while the Western Empire was gone, Rome's story was far from over. In the East, the Roman Empire, which we now call the Byzantine Empire, would live on for another 1,000 years, finally falling to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. And in the West, the ghost of Rome never really left. The Latin language evolved into French, Spanish, Italian, and Portuguese. Roman law became the bedrock of many modern legal systems. Roman architecture continues to inspire us in the domes and arches of our own cities. And the idea of a republic, with a senate and checks on power, deeply inspired thinkers of the Enlightenment and, through them, the founders of the United States. Perhaps most importantly, the Catholic Church, based in Rome, preserved Latin and Roman administrative traditions through the Middle Ages. The very idea of Rome, a universal, civilized order, would haunt the European imagination for centuries, inspiring everyone from Charlemagne to Napoleon. From a small village on the Tiber to the master of the world, the story of Rome is an incredible saga of ambition, genius, and collapse. Its rise and fall show us how civilizations are built and how they can break. Rome's empire of soldiers and stone may have crumbled, but its empire of ideas, in law, language, and government, is still all around us. To understand the Western world, you first have to understand Rome.